Conference of Mayors, Susan Howard from the National Association of Development Organizations, and Charlie Bartsch, who I'm sure all of you know, formerly senior advisor at the US EPA and now a consultant to communities in transition looking to revitalize their communities. We're going to start. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about what's going on here in Washington. It's very interesting. Obviously, we have a new president, a new administration, new head of EPA and other agencies, and some new leadership in the Congress as well. You can't avoid from watching the news knowing that things have definitely changed here in Washington. But in terms of brownfields redevelopment, I think there's a lot of opportunities out there. One, and we're going to talk more about this, there's growing bipartisan support for reauthorization of the Brownfields law, which was signed, can't believe it's 15 years ago now, in 2002. The new president, President Trump, has made it a priority to talk about and focus on jobs, economic development, and infrastructure. So as a result, there may be infrastructure legislation as well as tax reform legislation, and both of those could present some exciting opportunities for brownfields. And finally, the EPA Administrator Pruitt, who is from Oklahoma, which has a very strong brownfields program and a very strong commitment to brownfields, has expressed his strong support for enhancing the brownfields program. At the same time, if you take a look at the president's initial budget, and we're going to talk more in detail about each of these things, there are a number of programs that support brownfields redevelopment that are extremely vulnerable. And I'm not going to go through these now because you're going to hear more about them. So to kick this off, the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is to make sure that people understand the federal appropriations process so that you can orient yourselves and position yourselves to have maximum impact on the process. The first step, at least in this year's process, which is a little different because we have a new president and a new administration, is that the president proposed what was called his skinny budget, which is basically an outline of big picture numbers for each of the agencies with a minimum amount of detail in terms of specific programs. And that was released, I think, as most people know, in March. A second thing that's currently going on right now, the second thing is the other key part of the process is that there are 12 appropriations subcommittees in both the House and the Senate, and they will actually write the legislation and determine the levels of funding for the various agencies and various programs. And each of those appropriations subcommittees is right now in the process of accepting requests for funding priorities from individual members of Congress. Most of the House deadlines are upon us right now, and the Senate deadlines for their subcommittees have not been set yet, and they will probably be either later this month or early in May. The next thing that will happen is that the president and his administration will actually announce their detailed budget, and that's slated to come out in the beginning of May. Following that, the appropriations subcommittees will then actually write the legislation. That will happen probably in May and June in the House, and usually the Senate's a little later. They'll probably go June and July. We may see some floor action in the summer, and if not then, probably in September, and then the final legislation will be produced in the fall. So that's how the process works. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the various agency programs that support brownfields, and I'm going to ask Charlie Bartsch to talk a little bit about the the EPA Brownfields funding.
Great, thanks, Kenneth, and it's a pleasure to be joining the webinar. I just want to mention that the information that we obtained it from a memo that was produced by the Chief Financial Officer at EPA on March 21st. So I mean, this is the internal EPA document that lays out the proposal that is reflected in the skinny budget. As you all know, the EPA Brownfields funding supports planning and assessment and cleanup, and also job training and the technical assistance programs, and also provides resources to states to help them support their voluntary cleanup programs and some of the other innovative programs they like to do. Overall, the administration is looking to cut brownfields by about 13%. In some ways, this is actually not so bad, given the original budget, which the agency laid out early on. That budget called for the elimination of that program, along with a lot of other programs. But as Ken mentioned earlier, Administrator Pruitt certainly understands brownfields. He was familiar with them in Oklahoma, and so the skinny budget that came out called for $75 million for the basic brownfield grants. That's a cut, a $5 million cut. I think what's more significant is the funding to the states. You know, these are the state funds that support the voluntary cleanup programs and other things. Those would be cut by 30%, about $13 million, from $47.5 million to $33.4 million. And I just want to give you a couple of other pieces of information. Maybe, Ken, you can go to the next slide while I just kind of lay this out, because it'll be good just for people to see the numbers when we talk about some of this context. Just so people on the call understand sort of the context for the EPA budget overall, as well as for the Brownfields budget, was for the agency to focus on its core legal requirements. You know, just really carrying out the programs very specifically and very narrowly as they are defined in law. This means, you know, programs that are really operating at the federal level only, or national efforts. The budget suggests that programs that are not core and not federally focused, but those things that may be regionally focused, should just be devolved, you know, to the states or to local governments, who can then just kind of carry them on if they want to put their own money into it. So that's sort of some of the background on that. You can see the numbers, you know, for the project grants, the state funding. Some of that, you know, reduction, that devolution really goes to that. One of the things I want to mention is what the budget calls for in terms of brownfield staffing, because this could have some significant impacts, and people need to know this. And, you know, as they're talking about funding, they need to be cognizant of this, and they need to kind of, you know, talk up the need for staffing. The budget, according to the CFO's memo, headquarters full-time equivalent staff in the Brownfield office would be reduced by 8. And that's a little over a third of the entire office. So that's a fairly substantial cut. It also suggests that 47 regional FTEs in Brownfield be eliminated as well. So there's some potential things there you should know about, some potential challenges to the program. You know, just the staffing in general, I mean, one of the things that is being talked about in terms of the overall staffing cuts, which the agency or the skinny budget suggests that EPA's total staffing be reduced by 3,200 positions to about 11,500. One of the things under consideration is the elimination of one or more regional offices as part of that reduction. So again, a lot in flux, but a lot of things people need to know about, just in terms of, you know, how these programs run, including brownfields. And Ken, if I can just take another second, just to talk about, you know, some other related cuts that may be of interest to this crowd. The skinny budget calls for cutting Superfund by $330 million, about 40%. Talks about shedding about 90 Superfund FTEs, and it also talks about eliminating programs of interest to people who work on brownfields, things like Energy Star, the Green Power Partnership, environmental education, and environmental justice. All of those programs are proposed for elimination. So I think with that, I'll wait for questions, but I wanted to get that information out. Again, brownfields, the grants fared better than many other programs have fared in the skinny budget, but there's still a lot of cause for concern and a lot of need to kind of, tout the benefit of these programs.
Great. Thanks, Charlie. Now I'm going to ask Judy Sheehan from the Conference of Mayors to talk a little bit about the HUD CDBG program.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ken. And thanks, Charlie. And if I could just add just quickly, Administrator Pruitt did come to the leadership of the Conference of Mayors meeting, and what Ken and Charlie said is very accurate. He sang the praises of brownfields. He actually also talked about trying to get Superfund rather than just capped to get those to be cleaned up enough for revitalization. He had asked for as many best practices and examples of how this program does good work. The Conference of Mayors presented to him at least 10 books outlining all the best practices that you guys have featured, but it's never too late. And so just keep that in mind while we're thinking about how to enhance and save the program. While the HUD, or the EPA Brownfields program did pretty well, the community development block grants over at HUD did not. For those of you, you probably all know, but community development block grants are sort of the bread and butter of every city, over a population of 50,000. They get direct allocation every year. Then the states also get an allocation so that communities that are under the 50,000 threshold can also apply directly to their states. It's the most flexible funding and the only direct funding that local governments get. And cities have been using it for a variety of reasons, for a variety of different tasks, including brownfields redevelopment. And so not only did the skinny budget and everything we have heard for FY 2018 calls for the elimination of the Community Development Block Grants Program, which is about $3 billion a year. They've also targeted this year, FY 2017, they're asking for a 50% cut in order to start diverting some of the money towards building the wall to go between the U.S. and Mexico. The mayors are mobilized to try to stop this. We have met with various members of the Hill, both Republicans and Democrats, and have pleaded our case. And while they seem to be sympathetic, it's not. We are not resting on our laurels. If anyone would like, please go to our website at usmayors.org, and there is an entire listing. You can actually check to see how much your city gets every year in allocation. And we are strongly encouraging, I know we're going to get into the how do you save these programs, but one of the things we are asking people to do is call your congressional delegation, develop your best practices and different things you've used, CDBG, particularly as it relates to brownfields redevelopment in our case, but in anything. We're also asking for education of your local residents so that they know what your CDBG funds are used for. We actually have CDBG week coming up April 17th through the 22nd. And in that case, we are asking for people to do ask your congressional offices to come back and take tours of CDBG developed projects. And so I know many of you are on the line, are working for cities and working for mayors. We do have a sign-up letter on our website that I'm not sure if it's only open to cities or mayors or if they're open to other people as well. So please check that out as well. So once again, Mr. Mulvaney has basically said community development block grants. What was the exact quote? It's not well targeted to the poorest population and has not demonstrated results. We tend to we're trying to go prove them wrong. So we need your help. And with that, I'm done with my really sad report.
It's going to turn into a good news. We'll make
sure. Yes.
Lemonade out of these lemons.
Okay,
CDBG.
sure.
But it's going to require some work to do it. Charlie, do you want to add just a little bit on how valuable and important the block grants have been for brownfields around the country?
Well, I think Judy has laid this out. I guess I would just add that just, again, it's hard to collect total specific data, but we know from talking to communities and just kind of adding up some numbers that pretty much every year for at least the last decade, more CDBG money has gone into brownfield redevelopment than EPA money has. I mean, the flexibility of the tool and the ability of it to really kind of hone in on distressed areas and deal with urgent needs has really made it quite valuable and quite flexible, and some communities have been quite creative. So, I mean, it's almost losing that is almost like a double whammy to the Brownfields program. And actually, Ken, if I could just add one thing too, just picking up on Judy's comments about, some of the budget, discussion. The original budget, the document, the one that preceded the skinny budget, lifted a lot of its language from the Heritage Foundation blueprint, and the Heritage Foundation blueprint called Brownfields Corporate Welfare. So I think to pick up on Judy's idea of really collecting good examples and good information, those that show the but-for aspect of brownfields, especially the cleanup grants and the assessment grants, I mean, those would be, I think, quite valuable in showing, just really the necessity of the program. So I mean, I just wanted to mention that as well.
Great, thanks, Charlie and Judy. We're now going to turn to the Economic Development Administration, and I'm going to turn it over to Susan Howard with NATO, the National Association of Development Organizations. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Ken. Yes, I'm happy to provide the perspective on what the administration has proposed with regard to EDA, the Economic Development Administration. My organization is a key stakeholder for EDA. We represent local councils of government and regional planning organizations that are designated economic development districts with EDA. This means they have demonstrated that they have distressed communities that are in need of planning and economic development assistance work, and so they really rely on those core programs of EDA to do community and economic development. EDA funds projects in both urban and rural areas, but the majority of their work is in rural areas, and that's where the bulk of our membership is as well. So it really fills a very necessary need. There is a link between the EDA Public Works and Infrastructure funding and brownfields projects, as that funding is quite flexible, and folks have used it for all sorts of infrastructure projects, water, wastewater, road building, and associated projects with brownfields. I would say it's the most is the way it's been used most, just sort of prop up that associated work that comes along with the brownfields project. And there are a number of other EDA programs that touch on brownfields. The Investing in Manufacturing Communities Partnership, which is sort of a special initiative under the Obama administration that has, it was codified, sort of formalized. It's not an authorized program, but those communities that were designated sort of were made permanent before the new administration came in. And several of those partnerships have involved brownfields cleanup and tying that to manufacturing and a bigger plan. And what that IMCP program really does is bring together groups of folks who are in a region who are interested in advancing a manufacturing sector, building on the local assets that they already have. So, a good example of one of the IMCP community projects was in the Detroit area, dealing with the auto industry and looking at new ways to build upon existing relationships between private sector, public sector, universities, research, manufacturing, and sort of a big group of partners. And under the EDA umbrella, they were able to get some assistance in tapping into federal resources to help them implement their community plans for boosting manufacturing. The President's skinny budget for fiscal year 18 does propose to eliminate EDA, and that is something that has been I would say a talking point by groups like the Heritage Foundation and others. We have had to fight almost annually an amendment to the spending bill that funds EDA under the Department of Commerce to offset, or we've had to fight against an effort to eliminate the agency through the annual appropriations process. And so it wasn't a surprise when we saw that. It has also fallen under sort of the argument of this is corporate welfare. And our response to that is that there are small investments that really provide seed money to communities that are the most distressed and the most in need of assistance to either expand or bring new businesses to their communities. And those public works and infrastructure dollars go very far with a very limited amount of funding, particularly in rural communities. And, you know, the language in the skinny budget basically says that the EDA's programs are duplicative with programs of the U.S. Department of Agriculture and formula grants to states under the Department of Transportation. Well, if any of you have ever worked in transportation, you know that money goes down to states in block grants based on formula, and that is not a guarantee that that funding is going to go directly to local communities who may need a small investment to build an access road or to do broadband work or to do water or wastewater work to assist a small business or a manufacturing plant. So those are the kind of investments that that EDA makes and that we feel are important to preserve. The president has also, we've talked a little bit about the sort of confusing situation we're in right now between fiscal year 17, fiscal year 18, fiscal year 17. The administration has recommended a reduction in EDA programs of about $97 million. So we can move on to the next slide, and I'll touch just briefly on.
Sure. I was just going to emphasize that again, the EDA program, EDA has been a longtime partner with EPA and other agencies in brownfields, and the money is typically very flexible, and the thing that makes it, another thing that makes it different from Department of Transportation money is it has to be a link to economic development and job creation, and it's been very impactful, particularly on some smaller communities. So again, it's a really important program. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to mention just briefly that another important aspect of EDA's programming that can tie in as well is the planning money that they provide to the economic development districts, and that can tie into brownfields in the sense that that planning goes in to allow communities to create economic development strategies, which might include something like a revitalization of a brownfield site. So again, there are few places to go in the federal landscape for planning, and our experience is that is what some of the most distressed and rural communities need most, is that technical assistance to kind of prime themselves to be able to draw down federal funds, but that planning work has to happen first.
Right. All right, on to regional economic development commissions.
Sure, I'll just touch on this briefly. We work really closely with the major federal, state, local economic development commissions, the Appalachian Regional Commission, the Delta Regional Authority, the Denali Commission, and the Northern Border Regional Commission. Those programs are very localized and local and state and local driven. Although they're federal programs, the money is really gotten out very effectively across those regions, and the work is very collaborative, involving a lot of local stakeholders. And so again, the work of those regional commissions mirrors the work of what NATO members do in terms of supporting local community and economic development efforts across a number of federal agencies, including brownfields. And so the President's fiscal year 18 skinny budget does recommend elimination of all of those federal, state, regional commissions. That I think will be a little bit of a tough political fight. They, you know, particularly Appalachian Regional Commission has some very influential friends on the Hill and has been a long-standing entity to try to, you know, originally formed with the vision of bringing Appalachia up to par with the rest of the country economically. And they have done a lot of innovative and interesting things over the years. And so I think that, you know, there's a real value in their work. So that's one to keep your eye on if you are in one of those states or regions that has a federal economic development commission that covers your area. Moving on real quick to USDA. want to just touch base on that real quick. I mean, we work a lot with USDA Rural Development that also has infrastructure programs, particularly the water and wastewater programs, and also they have some rural business and cooperative grant programs that have been effective in leveraging community economic development. They also have community facilities programs that go to fund things like rural health centers, community centers, sort of things that are used primarily for bricks and mortar type projects in communities in need and in the most rural and underserved places. So we've been watching this very closely because of the proposed cuts in the budget. Overall, the skinny budget requests a reduction of, I think it's 21% in USDA rural development funding, or it may be the entire USDA budget, but included in that is an elimination of the grants and loans for water and wastewater infrastructure. And I can't begin to stress how important that program is for the most underserved parts of our country, and that water and wastewater service is essential to building any other kind of community investment or economic development work, whether it be attracting businesses and just quality of life issues for the residents there themselves, and keeping businesses there. So we see that as a real hit to the most vulnerable communities, frankly. And for for fiscal year 17, the President's budget does also request some cuts to some of those key programs, water and wastewater and rural business and cooperative grants. And it basically instructs them that they can't carry over any money from the unspent from the previous year, and which again just essentially means a rescission in their current funding. So those three programs in particular are the ones that NATO has been working on with the release of the skinny budget, and I'm happy to take any questions when we wrap up at the end. Thanks, Ken.
Great. Thanks a lot, Susan. I'm going to take a couple of questions now before we move on to a few more details on the process. First, somebody asked, will the presentation be available? The answer is yes, the slides will be available as well as a recording of the webinar. Second, this is a follow-up for you, Judy, on the best management practices that you provided to Administrator Pruitt. Are those something that people can get their hands on? Are they reports or?
They were actually all of our old reports that when EPA funded us, we collected them all. They were actually all on our website, but our website has just gotten changed in the last 2 weeks, and so we are transferring, right now we're in the process of transferring what we call our legacy website into our new website. So they're not quite available, but they should be in the next 2 weeks or so.
Great.
Sorry.
And then again, can you tell folks when is CDBG week later this month? Which week is it?
Yes, it is April 17th through the 22nd.
Great. And then Charlie, can you, the question is about the impact on ancillary EPA programs like job training, area-wide planning grants. Those are wrapped into the grants, right, Charlie?
Right. Those are wrapped into the grants, and quite honestly, there is some discretion within, OLM, the Office of Land and Emergency Management, to figure out those shares of funding. A big question on that is, since there's no assistant administrator who has been named yet, if someone is named, that person may have, some of their own ideas or priorities as to how they want to kind of continue those or not continue those, specific sort of subsets of the program.
Great. Okay, so we're going to move on to the process about how we work to defend and protect the funding. This is really important. I want to stress, first of all, now the administration gets to propose the budget, but they don't get to decide. Congress gets to decide, and it's ultimately a negotiation with the administration, but Congress really writes the legislation that will be the ultimate budget that gets shipped off to the president to sign, and it's in the version of the 12 appropriations bills. You can see here are the funding levels that we're recommending. We want to be very aggressive with the EPA program, not to say that we're going to get the full $250 million, but I think with the growing bipartisan support for reauthorization in the hearings this week and last week, there seemed to be strong recognition amongst both Republicans and Democrats that there wasn't enough funding being spent on an annual basis, and so I think we should push as hard as we can to use this opportunity to press for more funding. And then in terms of HUD, there's a dear colleague going around on the Hill asking for $3.3 billion, which is 10% above the current level. EDA, you can see, and USDA Rural Development, you can see the current levels of funding. So what's the strategy here? So there's a two-pronged strategy that we are proposing. One is for all of you to contact your members of the House and the Senate and to get them involved. And they can be involved in two ways. One is each individual member of the House and Senate has the opportunity to submit their own personal requests of funding priorities to the various appropriations subcommittees. Number one, so we recommend that you ask people to do that. And then the second way they can join in is typically what happens for many programs is that a couple of members of Congress will get together and start circulating a letter that a bunch of members of Congress will sign on together that again goes to the appropriations subcommittees asking for specific levels of funding. I know there's already one on the community development block grants. We're looking at working with our colleagues here to focus on the Brownfields program. Susan, I don't know if there will be one. Do you know if there will be dear colleagues on EDA and USDA?
The EDA House letter has closed. There was one. It just closed at the end of last week. There's a Senate one in the works. And on rural development funding, we're working on something now with some other coalition partners. So once I have, I can try to get word to folks that can be in touch with me to get the details on that once we have something formal.
Great. Yeah, so we'll, in our follow-up, we will have those details for everybody and make sure that you can ask, have the right language in your sample letter to ask your members of Congress to sign on to these letters. Then after that, so those are the two ways. Each individual members can submit requests, and also there are these joint letters called Dear Colleague letters that will go to the appropriations subcommittees. In addition, we're going to work with our colleagues here in Washington to develop national letters from a variety of groups that we will invite you to sign on to those so that we can get as many people to sign on as possible. So that will be the other option. So we will, again, we'll let you know how you can sign on to those letters. And again, the most important thing is to make sure that Congress hears from all of us and all of you. Very quickly, here are the key appropriations leaders, just so you know. The Interior and Environment Subcommittee funds EPA, and you can see the chair and the ranking member, which is the leading Democrat on the subcommittees. The Transportation HUD Subcommittee funds the CDBG program. You can see the leaders there. So again, if you're from any of these states, obviously you're going to have even greater influence on these people, and it's very important that you contact them directly if you're from any of these states. For the Economic Development Administration funding, it's the Commerce, Justice, Science Subcommittee. And then for the U.S. Department of Agriculture funding, it's obviously the Agriculture Subcommittee. In terms of key messages to deliver, one I think is really important is to remind folks about the long-standing, strong bipartisan support for both the Brownfields law, the original passage, and the funding. There were, Republican leaders leading the charge and were lead sponsors of the bill in the House and the Senate, and it was signed by a Republican president. So this is not just a Democratic program. This is very much a bipartisan program. This program produces economic results. Numbers are shown here. It obviously produces environmental results, and it's money that's very well spent. According to EPA analysis, every EPA dollar invested in brownfields leverages an additional $18 in revitalization investment.
Ken, I just want to, I'm sorry,
Charlotte,
Ken, I just want to add one thing to that too, especially to folks who are reaching out to Republican members. I mean, the Brownfield program, in community after community has been critical to infrastructure redeployment. It's been critical to manufacturing. And so I think those are also two messages. You can really, if you're trying to talk with somebody who, sort of their gut reaction is, well, this is just another federal program. There's private sector, direct private sector linkages that you can really emphasize, like I said, in manufacturing and infrastructure. So I just wanted to mention that.
Great. Again, in terms of next steps, we will provide a sample letter as well as a national letter for you to sign on to. And then also you can get these slides, but if you follow this link and put in your zip code, if you don't know who your member of the House is, Senate's pretty easy. There are 2 for each state. But if you don't know who your House member is, you can put your zip code in and this is on the League of Women Voters website. You can find out who your member is in the House of Representatives. Finally, this is a really critical time for us to be heard. I just cannot overstate that enough. We got a new administration and president. We got a Congress that's looking at things differently. Clearly, budgets are going to be vulnerable. But again, Congress will ultimately decide, and there are going to be some cuts, but they're going to cut the least in places where they hear the most. So it's really important. We have an incredibly good story to tell, so it's important to be out there to tell it and to let people know that we're watching and that we want their support. So that's our discussion of funding. And again, if you have any questions, please type them in the question box on your screen there, and we'll take the questions as we have before. I'm going to now turn it over to Judy, who's going to talk a little bit about the effort to reauthorize the Brownfields law. Judy?
Thank you very much, Ken. And I know for those of you who have been with us for the long time, it took 9 years to authorize the Brownfields bill originally, and now it feels like it's, what, 15 years now? So, since the last time it passed, and so it keeps on plugging along. And just to let you know, we've been working on Brownfields Reauthorization for a while, but in the last year, particularly in the last few months, there is a newfound enthusiasm to reauthorize the Brownfields bill. Last year, a Brownfields bill did get passed out of the committee on the Senate side, but let's talk about this year. So as Ken mentioned, there's been 2 bipartisan hearings on Brownfields only, but I want to let you know there's actually been 4 hearings in total, 2 by the Energy and Commerce, House Energy and Commerce, and 2 by the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where we had mayors testify, and we were specifically asked to talk about brownfields redevelopment as part of our testimony. So we did do that, and I will have to say that it was the only topic out of all of them that has gotten strong bipartisan support. You see the Republicans and Democrats, I mean, joking with each other, talking about the importance of the program, and they've said numerous times now, it's like, yeah, I think we can work with you on this issue. So just in the last week, we have had actually 3, our slides are already outdated, we have 3 Brownfields bills that have been introduced, and I just want to run through the 3 bills and the numbers and give you some highlights of each one of them, and then we can ask for questions later. The first one is H.R. 1758. It's the Brownfields Reauthorization Act of 2017. This is a bipartisan bill that was introduced by Representative Esty, Katko, DeFazio, and Napolitano. Just some highlights of the bill, and just FYI, Ms. Esty and Mr. Katko are on the Energy and Commerce Committee, but they've taken a lot of the recommendations of our original Brownfields Coalition and incorporated them. That is the other good thing, is a lot of these bills that I'm going to talk about have a lot of similar aspects to them, all based on our recommendations that we dusted off and keep on reintroducing. So they've increased the cleanup grant amounts from $200,000 to $600,000. They create a $950,000 multi-purpose grant. Some issue areas that we would like to talk a little bit more about is they do talk about submitting an overall plan in the proposed area, demonstrate capacity, and you have 3 years to spend. One of our questions is what does an overall plan mean, and can you vary it depending upon, because our vision was always to make this as market friendly as possible and to be able to move with developers and the needs that arise. H.R. 1758 also includes administrative costs. As you know, the original bill did not allow for any grants to take administrative costs out. That limit is 9%. They take care of pre-2002 sites, those cities and communities that took over properties prior to the Brownfields law getting passed. Because they couldn't go through all appropriate inquiry, they weren't as eligible to get grants, etc. This would eliminate that. They also do nonprofit eligibility to apply for cleanup grants, and then they appropriate $250 million from 2017 through 2022. The next bill I want to just briefly discuss is the discussion draft, which is in the Energy and Commerce. If you go onto their website and look at the hearing that happened yesterday, April 4th, you will see an attachment, and that's called the discussion draft. And that is what the committee right now is looking for comments and suggestions. If possible, if you do submit these comments and suggestions, if you could please reach out to me so I can talk to you and find out what you think about some of these things, I'd be very appreciative. They increased the cleanup grant amounts from $200,000 to $500,000, and in special circumstances, $750,000. They create a $1 million multi-purpose grant. Once again, ask for an overall plan. They also require ownership if you're going to clean up the property. And I'm not sure, to be honest, I would like feedback from you all, maybe not on this call, but in separate, regarding whether that's a problem or not. They also give you 5 years to spend the money. They also allow administrative costs up to 5%. This bill also seems to take care of a little bit more liability issues. They also include the pre-2002 sites. They also, we think, cover voluntary and involuntary acquisition. They use some pretty creative language. We think that's covered, but we're checking with lawyers right now to see if that is true. That's under Section 1 of this bill. Petroleum, they took our language, I believe, for no viable responsible party. They also clarified a leaseholder interest. They also include nonprofits being eligible to apply for funding. And then what they also have that's a little different is they have an added criteria for renewable energy. I think it's just a criteria that's part of the checklist, but we're just making sure of that. There is no dollar amount authorized, but it seemed like there was, once again, very bipartisan support to at least maintain funding, but even the Republicans were talking about how good this program was and maybe they should reauthorize it at a higher level. However, the House has interesting rules about PAYGO and whether they're allowed to introduce something that, beyond the current appropriations. However, the other interesting thing, that feedback I've been getting from staff from both the transportation infrastructure as well as energy and commerce, is that the leadership of the House is looking at brownfields as possibly part of their infrastructure package, Mr. Trump's infrastructure package. And so maybe we would not have followed those same rules of PAYGO that we have to do before. The last bill I want to talk about is H.R. 1747. That was also introduced on March 28th. This is Mr. Pallone and Tonko's bill. This is just a Democratic bill. It's called the Brownfields Authorization Increase Act of 2017. It also strikes, we think, well, it says specifically, strikes involuntary acquisition, makes nonprofits eligible, increases the cleanup grant amounts to $750,000, and you can reapply and get a waiver, but you have a limitation of $1.5 million to do cleanup. They allow 10% of your grant to be set aside for what they call indirect costs, which includes investigation and identification of contamination, design and perform response actions, monitoring natural resources. They also cover pre-2002 sites eligibility. They also create a multi-purpose grant worth $1.5 million. You have to submit an overall plan, you have to demonstrate capacity, and you have 3 years to spend it. You also have to be an owner of the property to clean up the site. You can do assessment if you're not an owner, but you can't clean it up. It also establishes a grant program on sustainable reuse and alternative energy, which would be grants to encourage sustainability, ecosystem, and habitat restoration. And it looks like there's a set aside for that of 7.5% of the total budget. They also have a section for staffing for small and disadvantaged communities, which would allow EPA to assign an employee to help build capacity. They also have a small community technical assistance program for communities under 20,000, and those grants in $10,000 increments would be available to institutions, et cetera, to provide technical assistance to small communities. Appropriations starts at $350 million for fiscal year 2018. It goes up to $600 million in 2023 in $50 million increments. And state responses also go up from $70 million in 2018 to $120 million in 2023. So that is a lot of information. I am going to try to do a side-by-side analysis of these, but as I mentioned, these all just got introduced in the last 7 days. And also, like I said, energy and commerce is, and actually the SD bill, as I think the loan bill, they're looking for feedback. So we have high hopes that we will get something sooner than later. On the Senate side, we do have a new chair. It's Mr. Barrasso from Wyoming. Mr. Inhofe is still on the committee, and but the general counsel for the EPW committee is Susan Bodine, who helped draft the original Brownfields bill back in 90-something. So we have some good people in the mix, and so, like I said, I would welcome feedback. I would welcome your thoughts on these bills. I'm at Judy Shane at the Conference of Mayors, so I'm sure Ken or someone can give you all my contact information if that's possible. So,
great.
And that's it for me.
Thanks, Judy. The one thing I want to emphasize out of those, I think most of it is pretty straightforward, but if you have city attorneys and if you can have your attorneys look at the liability protection enhancements for public agencies, you know, we want to make sure we get that as best as we can get it, make sure
Yes.
it works. So, so I would just emphasize that. And then very briefly, we're not going to look at this, but the committees that have jurisdiction over the Brownfields bill, the House Energy and Commerce Committee has primary jurisdiction. They've done the discussion draft that Judy talked about. Then the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee will also have to approve the bill. And then in the Senate, it's the Senate Environment Committee. And I'm not going to go over all these people. And again, things you can do is urge your members to support reauthorization. I think another thing, it's very valuable to just educate your members and their staff about your projects, invite them to ribbon cuttings, tours, and events, send them photos, news clips, project summaries, excuse me, talk about the benefits to your community, both economic benefits, environmental benefits, quality of life benefits, the whole bit. But members of Congress love photo opportunities, number one, and they also love to touch and feel and experience real life projects that are happening in their districts. So to the extent that you can share that with your members of Congress and with their staff, both, you know, their Washington staff comes out there periodically, but it's very valuable for their local and state staff to come see your projects as well. So got a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. There's one question about the federal brownfields tax deduction for expensing cleanup. You know, what's the status of that? Where does that fit in? And so the answer to that, and I'll ask Judy and Charlie and Susan if you want to add to this, but essentially the reauthorization would not include the tax credit because that would mean the bill would have to go to the tax committees. However, there is certainly going to be many proposals in consideration of tax legislation, and that will be the opportunity to reintroduce the tax incentive, even though it's expired, and it has been expired for several years. The challenge, however, is going to be really making the case for it, because the theory behind tax reform is they're looking to reduce rates and get rid of various incentives rather than adding new incentives. They're looking to take money from getting rid of incentives and use that to reduce corporate and individual tax rates. So I think that would be a challenge. I don't know, Charlie or Judy, if you have anything you want to add to that, or Susan.
Just at the hearing, this is Judy, just at the hearing yesterday, there were a couple mentions, particularly on the Republican side, about what type of tax incentives would encourage people to redevelop these sites, and are there things, and can we put our heads together? And the mayor actually, talked about local tax incentives, but they said yes, something on a federal level would be even more, even more helpful. So they're not on the right committee, as you mentioned, Ken, but I think who knows what might be thrown out there, given the fact that they especially want to look at all these tax breaks in order to encourage infrastructure investment, for example. So if we could link back to brownfields, we might have a little bit better of a leg to stand on.
Right.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I mean, I think you and Ken, you and Judy have kind of, I think, captured that. I guess I would just add to that is if anybody in the call, I mean, if you have any sense that your own member who might be on Ways and Means or Senate Finance has some interest in this, feel free to connect them with one of us that spoke today, because we can give them background. I mean, I've actually given background to a couple of offices who unfortunately chose not to proceed. But I mean, we can do that. I mean, we've got stuff we can give them to kind of help make the case and try to cultivate some interest if anybody knows of some out there.
And Okay, this is totally unrelated, but I forgot to mention this. One of the things that none of the bills have covered, though, is Good Samaritan or liability protection. It's not that the staff haven't thought this is willing to do it, but they just can't figure out how to do it without making it a major Superfund carve-out. So if you have any creative thoughts on that, I'm sorry, I'm completely in the wrong spot here, but if you could think about that and get back to us, that'd be fantastic.
And Judy, can you explain?
Judy,
can you explain what the Good Samaritan provision aims to do?
Our original plan for in the Brownfields Coalition for the Good Samaritan was groups, for example, like Trouts Unlimited, Ducks Unlimited, wanted to simply go on brownfield properties and start and clean them up. I think most of the time they were talking about illegal dumping, just cleaning out the trash, but because of the fact they were not allowed to go on the property and even unearth anything without invoking liability fears, they just don't. The mayor's mindset is like the more the merrier to help it clean it up as long as you don't cause more harm. So, and I think that's for a lot of people. It's just like we need more people to clean this up. We need more actors, not less. So that's definitely more of a Republican versus Democratic thing. The Republicans like, yeah, that's fine. Democrats are like, oh, no, we can't touch liability in that aspect. So.
And Charlie, there is a question about the Colonius funding, which EPA I know does funding.
That is proposed for elimination.
Okay,
it's proposed for elimination. Every single regionally focused initiative is proposed for total elimination or practically zeroing out. I mean, that's the Colonius, it's, Puget Sound, it's Great Lakes, it's Gulf stuff. Yeah, all that's gone.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And one last question for Judy, I believe. Again, where can they find the CDBG allocation on the mayor's website?
Go to usmayors.org, and one of the flashing things that goes by is Save CDBG. And just click on that link, and then there will be a little tag saying find out how much your city earns or something like that. And you just click on that, type the name of your city in, and you'll find out how much money you make.
Great. And then finally, again, the slides and the recording will be available afterwards, number one, and number two. Judy's doing summaries and side-by-side analysis, and others will be two of the various brownfields proposals, and we will figure out how to make those available to people once they're done in the next few weeks as well. Any final comments from Susan? I'll let you go first.
I don't know. Just appreciate the opportunity to join the webinar. And, one thing I think that's key during this time is coalition building and working with partners that traditional and non-traditional. So we'll be looking to do that with all the folks on this call and others as we move forward.
Great. And Charlie, any final words?
I guess my final word would be just in general, I think, to emphasize your point, Ken, the need to get information to, the congressional offices is critical. And if the extent to which you can, include in information and best practices, either private sector endorsements of the program or of projects, or a good discussion of, really the public piece of the public-private partnerships, I think will be very valuable in making the case.
Great. And Judy?
No, it's been a pleasure. I think we're good. We're as close as we're going to get right now for Brownfields Reauthorization, and let's see if we can hit this home.
Great. So, and thanks again to Sarah with CCLR and the whole Center for Creative Land Recycling team for putting this together. We really appreciate it, and we will be working with CCLR and rest of the folks on the call, both on reauthorization and also putting together a very aggressive campaign to fight for brownfields funding. And we, as we've mentioned many times, I'll just say it again, we need your help. We need you to be talking about the great stuff that you're doing in your community and sharing that with your House and Senate offices. So we will be in touch with sample letters and further instruction. So with that, thanks everybody. We really appreciate your participation. Thanks to Judy, Susan, Sarah, and Charlie, and hope everybody has a great rest of your week. Take care, everybody.
All right. Hey, thank you, Ken.